Often, you could describe events like this as being in commemoration of something, but it's not. This is not a commemoration. This is a celebration, for sure, but it's also, I think, an opportunity for us to remember the sort of things that the great Bernie Grant talked about and organised for and campaigned for. And that's what this evening is really all about. But there is a remembrance that I think we should all do. It was a couple of years ago, the last time we held an event here for the Bernie Grant Trust, was right on the cusp of the beginning of the pandemic. Since that time, we've lost lots of our people. We've lost lots of our friends, some of our relatives, people we've heard about, famous people, not so famous people, doesn't matter. We've lost people through this pandemic, and I'd like to ask you to join with me, if you're able to stand for a moment or two to remember those people who we've lost. And one of the things that I learned from Bernie all those years ago is you have to tell it like it is. And you have to stand up for what you believe in. And that's what we have to all do now. So when we look back in history, when we look back to the campaigns that we've run in the past, I think it's really important to remember that things never end, but campaigns of yesterday become the campaigns of today, and they become the campaigns of tomorrow. And it's up to us to keep that light burning that Bernie inherited from so many other people before him, and that we inherit from Bernie and lots of other people around that time, and that we have to carry that forward for the fights that are important today. And that's why the panel discussion this evening isn't just some academic discussion. It's to remind us about the battles that we need to stand up and fight today. So we've got with us this evening Professor Dan Hicks from Oxford University. We found out that he just lives up the road, in the posh bit up the road from me, not where I live, in Oxford. It's not that posh. We've got Onyekachi Wambu, who's the director of AFFORD, which is the African Foundation for Development. We have my great friend, Belle Ribeiro Addy, MP for Streatham, chair of the all-party parliamentary group on African reparations. I mean, you could actually cheer if you wanted to all of these. So we can kind of backdate that applause a little bit to everybody else that are kind of mentioned as well. And we also have, of course, Dr. Janice Cheddi, writer and researcher on contemporary visual culture and heritage as well. You get some applause. We've got some really distinguished guests with us as well. We have the Right Honourable Diane Abbott, no less. We have Kelvin Okafor, who drew the incredible portrait of Bernie that now hangs in Parliament. Are you here? I don't know if this person's here, but it'd be a miracle if he's ever on time. Jeremy Corbyn, MP. Is it? Oh, he's got one. I'm flabbergasted, right? Absolutely flabbergasted. He'll remind me of that forever now, honestly. Also, we have with us Bernie Grant Trust heritage ambassadors who were part of the Marginalised No More project before the lockdown. I also want to say we got Sharon Grant here as well, secretary to the trust. He strangely didn't put her name on the list of people to thank, which is so Sharon, actually. But thank you, Sharon, for all you do for the trust and to keeping the fight alive as well. And we've got other members of the Bernie Grant Trust trustees here as well. Special shout out, not the only one, but special shout out to Professor, because we haven't got many black professors, but Professor Patrick Vernon as well. Now, we've also got with us Peter Murphy. And Peter is a filmmaker and campaigner on stolen artifacts. Now, all those years ago, Peter made a film that has just been kind of rediscovered about Bernie going up to Glasgow and demanding that the bronzes be given back. Anyway, I have some news. We could have had like a drum roll or something, couldn't we, really? Yeah, that'll do. Yeah. But it's just been announced today that the Benin Bronzes from Kelvin Museum are going to be returned. Bad time, really, isn't it? I mean, I don't know how it takes so long, but, you know, better to the party late than never, I suppose. All right, well, let's go to the main event of the evening. We have, apart from COVID times, we have a lecture every year. The last lecture, a couple of years ago now, was done by my right honourable friend, Jeremy Corbyn, over there, which was a great evening as well, and I'm sure tonight is going to be a great evening. We have Professor Dan Hicks. Professor Hicks is Professor of Contemporary Archaeology at the University of Oxford and a curator at the Pitts Rivers Museum and author of the best-selling The Brutish Museums. Over to you, Professor. Please give him a welcome.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. And how amazing it is that that news came. I mean, absolutely, none of us were expecting the news that those objects that we were looking at in that film would today be approved in the council meeting in Scotland. So fantastic news. So it reminds us, I think, it's a good moment to start then. I'm going to talk for about half an hour now. And then, importantly, we're going to have a conversation because it reminds us that so many at the time argued that Bernie's campaign to see the Benin Bronzes returned had failed. And yet here we are 25 years on and the bronzes are starting to return. So I think in my field, in the field of museums, of anthropology, of art, there's no book that has dated faster in recent years that seems more out of date than the book that only came out a little over 10 years ago called The History of the World in 100 Objects from Neil McGregor, who used to run the British Museum at the time at which, of course, they were saying no. So that model, I mean, it made fantastic radio. It made for a good book. But the whole nature of that framing, that there is a curator, a male white expert who is going to tell you a story that's about the whole world and every kind of object and the whole of the human past, all of the cultures of the world, and that is a voice of authority. That already at the time, in 2010, was not how things were happening in our museums. In our museums, we have started not to curate, but to co-curate. We've started not to simply state our privilege or our positionality, because so often when you do that, it serves simply to reinforce it. We have started to try to experiment with ways of how that locatedness, how that authority can be undermined. So in reflection of that for this evening, this isn't really a lecture. This is a kind of segue in between a film that we just saw and a conversation we're having here that we'll be having. Because the purpose of this, I mean, I've got some facts I can share, which emerge out of a part of, if you like, my privilege here, which is not only about sort of whiteness or maleness or being based at an elite institution, it's about the knowledge that the curator has access to. So I want to share some of that knowledge, and I want to start really by arguing, which is the purpose of the title of our event, that it isn't a culture war. We read a lot in the press, and we hear a lot from the right about the idea that we're in the middle of a culture war. It's not a culture war, it's a war on culture. And I'm hoping to convince you in the short amount I have available in order to talk to you, that war has a history. And it's a history which reaches back to the attack upon Benin 125 years ago. Because what you might not have realized is that 100-year anniversary that we just heard about, exactly 25 years on, we are in the 125th anniversary now. So the culture war is not a culture war, it's a war on culture, and it's about the weaponization of arts and culture. So let's start with Fanon, I think, is one really helpful place to start. So if we go back to the mid-50s and the Fanon essay on racism and culture, Fanon introduces two ideas, two forms of racism. First off, he says, in the 19th century, a certain form of racism with which anthropology, of course, was incredibly, intimate, which was a racism, it's what he calls vulgar racism. It was a racism that sought to write inequality into the natural world. It was a racism obsessed with the body, with the fake racial science. It was an approach that used the museum, the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, in order to try to display human remains, ancestral remains, in order to tell the racist lies that went with ideologies of supremacy. But hand in hand with that vulgar racism, at the same moment we learn in this essay by Fanon, there was a second kind of racism that evolved and that emerged, and which we're only just now starting, to our shame, in our museums, in our universities, in our art institutions, in our public streets, starting to get our eye into. And that, as he explains, is a cultural racism. So after we beat the fascists at the end of the Second World War, after we fought those ideologies of hate that if you like, revealed that idea that the forms of that first form of racism, of course, has no place in our society. We saw in our museums the displays of human remains, any that remained were physically dismantled. And for many years now, human remains have been returned to indigenous communities around the world and to African nations. There's so much more work to do. But those arguments that were going on in the 1990s about returns in terms of ancestral remains were contentious at the time, but actually we have now, this is sort of a normal part of our work in museums. But those artworks, those works of culture, those things on display not in the Natural History Museum, but in the Culture History Museum, in our archaeology museums, in our anthropology museums, which are displayed to tell the very same racist lies, but using culture rather than, as it were, nature, we haven't started to dismantle what in the book I call that white infrastructure, the infrastructure of a form of cultural whiteness that was so important to European imperialism in the later 19th century, and which wrote itself into institutions which were, of course, a part of how they work, is they appear to be timeless, is they are spaces for preservation. They are spaces of time in that what they do is they seek to make things last. So the curator's role, of course, in part, is the role of the conservator. The role of the curator is to keep some things the same, to make sure that the ironwork isn't rusting away and the textiles aren't being eaten by moths. But there's been this slow mission creep from the late 19th century onwards that saw the role of the museum curator as someone who sought not only to keep the museum the same or the objects themselves the same, but to seek to try to stop the world from changing around that institution. How did that racist use of culture work? Well, let's take the example of the Benin expedition of 1897. This is a key moment in the expansion of informal empire, of the protectorates, of what they used to call the gentlemanly capitalism kind of approach of this wasn't about the imposition of a crown colony at that point, although it was a key step towards the formation of what would later be Nigeria. This was about sort of soft power. This was about the idea of the protectorate in the way that the mafia protect you, right? And that narrative over protection finds itself very strangely moving from the protectorate of the 1890s into the language of the museum itself, as we heard a moment ago, 100 years on. So the attempt was to remove the power, the sovereign powers of individuals like the Oba, like the royal court, that those traditional powers that the British and the French and the Germans had, of course, in so many ways used in those years after abolition, in those years of what we're told by so many historians of the right was the suppression of the slave trade up and down the West African and the South African coasts, but in many ways was really the Royal Navy attacking a whole series of locations on the soils of Africa. And the sheer number of people who lost their lives in those constant attacks is untold. But the attack upon Benin, crucially, was a naval attack. And it was a naval attack that sought not only to kill and to physically destroy the royal palace. This is a civilization that had been there for 1,000 years, which had this really unique artistic tradition that reached back 500 or 600 years. These items, more than 10,000 items were looted in this chaotic sort of attack. But that looting wasn't a side effect of that attack. Looting art was a tactic of war. It sought to do three things. It sought to remove sovereignty, to make to say these sovereign royal objects are not yours anymore. They are European now. It sought to make a permanent destruction of structures and the beliefs of traditional religion, because these were sacred objects, but it also, thirdly, and maybe most powerfully, sought to undertake a long-term cultural dispossession, to create a sort of a ground zero from which the whole notion of culture had to be rebuilt, or that was certainly the attempt at that time. Within weeks, the Benin items, the ivories and the bronzes, such as we just saw a moment ago, were on display in Berlin, in Oxford, in London. And at the British Museum, they were shown in the Assyrian saloon, alongside items from the Middle East, from the Bronze Age, and from ancient Egypt. And the message was very clear. Your culture is dead. We have bombed you back into the Bronze Age. This is the sense of what the museum as weapon, the co-option of the museum, just as the museum had been co-opted for those racist displays of human remains, they were co-opted to tell the story, of the defeat of the Oba. As my book shows, this is now, because of the art markets in the past 100 years, the spread of these objects, the soldiers and sailors and administrators who looted these items, who took them for personal gain, sold them or handed them down to their sons and daughters who sold them. More than 200 individuals or so maybe took them, and of those 10,000 objects, they're in hundreds of museums around the world now. When they opened the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, they had to have a Benin Bronze. To be a world culture museum, to be a universal museum, you have to have a Benin Bronze, and you have to tell this story. And it's quite a particular story about how there was a small number of white men who tried to gain access to the Oba at a certain sacred time of year, and they were denied access. And in the process, no one quite understands how, there were 2 people killed, or maybe 4 people killed, or maybe 5 people killed in some accounts of it. And for that reason, this incredible massive attack with Maxim guns and with electric wiring and with the mountain guns, the 7-pounders, the 12-pounders, with 3 million bullets in the most up-to-date rifles that the Navy had to hand in hand with a corporate attack by the Royal Niger Company in the north of Nigeria, because this is a particular episode in what is a corporate, militarist and ultra-violent form of empire. So the story is of the punitive expedition. Something happened that meant that we had to do this. Look what you made us do, is, of course, the narrative. And that starts something, it's strangely familiar in the so-called culture war today. When you see an attack upon a lecturer who chooses to teach, to add into a wholly white curriculum some other voices, the argument is that that's a cancellation, and therefore it's fine for the Telegraph or whoever it is this week, to make an attack upon that lecturer, upon that institution, if it's someone who is seeking to decolonize. So that notion of the punitive expedition has this strange afterlife, and it's part of what we are working with. It's part of, what in the book I call white projection, the projection of that violence inherent to the ideology of cultural whiteness, which has in it, inherent in the patriarchal, colonialist, ultra-violent form that finds its way into the museum. I mean, really, we're talking about the proto-fascist here, really. And while, of course, we have, these are not the same histories as we see when these forms of mass modern warfare, the machine guns that were tested on African bodies in the later 19th century, find their way to Europe. So, of course, does the looting of art. while these are not the same processes, we as institutions, we as museums, we as societies understanding those histories can learn from each of those different locations and see there's a history to these ideologies. So restitution's now happening, and we find ourselves, I think, now in this country in the end, but not yet the final moments, I think, of the war on culture. We find ourselves caught between the fall of Colston and the yet-to-fall moment of Rhodes in Oxford. We find ourselves in between the return of the Benin objects from Aberdeen and when will we see the returns from London and from the British Museum. This reminds us, I think, of something that I want to make a connection with here, which is the restitution movement as a long-standing African-led movement which saw the first successes of the return of the Benin items, of the royal items, in the form of two coral work crowns and also a coral work robe, saw those returns as early as 1938. So this isn't something someone just thought up in 2020. It isn't just something someone thought up for the 100-year anniversary. It's a long-standing African-led movement, and it's not only, of course, about Nigeria. There are the parallel movements from other African nations, and importantly, non-nation-state actors as well. But as well as restitution as a long-standing movement, so is fallism. And as forms of anti-colonialism, the fallism movement, I think, is able to tell us a lot. First off, we could look at the verdict on the Colston Four. What an important moment for those of us interested in these enduring histories of cultural racism, because the jury were given, the ability there to weigh up the effect and the relative severity and importance of two crimes. The crime against the object, the crime in terms of the destruction of an object, of a public sculpture, on the one hand, and the hate crime, which it was put forward was enacted every day you leave this damned image up. Erected in 1895, 2 years before the Benin attack. It's an image of a 17th century slave trader in the city of Bristol with one very clear message that, since the middle of the 20th century, as the city continues to diversify, that hurt gets more and more every day. So that and the verdict, the fact the jury said, of course, the hate crime, that's the worst one. It's fine to remove something that is so hurtful. To learn that from the fallism movement, we need to understand the displays of the Benin Bronzes, the narrative that's told, the story constantly. Every day you open your doors of these museums, you tell the story of the defeat of the Oba, of the taking of these sacred royal objects, and of, we're not going to give them back. That reinscribes the violence every day. So this retain and explain argument, that you just rewrite the label, you rewrite it really, really honestly. You tell the story really like you're saying how bad it was. What that misses is that's why these things were there in the first place. They were always there to tell the story of violence and of supremacy, of a technological supremacy in the form of the Maxim machine gun and the brass bullets which it fired, and then before you know it, you're into the artistic superiority and the cultural superiority that says, well, we're going to put these things on display. We are not going to return them because if we return the Benin Bronzes, they will be destroyed by war. They will be stolen. They will be sold off by the museums, they won't be displayed, they'll just be held by the Royal Court. They won't be seen by as many people. The reality is, each of those lies, and actually my colleague Bénédicte Savoy, with her most recent book, which is just out in English, called Africa's Struggle for Her Art, and is really the companion volume to my book, because she talks about the later histories, and she shows how in the Year of Africa in 1960, there were meetings between civil servants from France and Germany and the UK comparing notes. All these newly independent African nations are going to want their stuff back. How can we really quickly do two things? Invent a whole load of laws, which of course in our case is in the form of the British Museum Act, but also a series of myths. Because each of those things that they said would happen, might happen, if you return the Benin Bronze, really has happened to Benin Bronzes in this country. In Liverpool and Hull, in the Second World War, the museums were bombed by the Luftwaffe, and there are physically damaged Benin Bronzes in the collections that were taken out of the debris. The British Museum sold off the Benin Bronzes in significant numbers in the 50s, 60s, and as late as the 1970s to American dealers and to the colonial government of Nigeria. And in terms of not on display, where do we start? I mean, when we're talking about African, so the Savoy report, the reports that was written for Macron, by Felwine and Bénédicte when it came out in 2018, made, we can argue about, how useful this number is, but I think it's a useful benchmark. 90% of the heritage and arts of the continent of Africa is outside the continent. But we can add to that number a far more shocking number, which is that actually less than 1%, almost certainly less than 0.1% of those objects that were taken from the continent of Africa under colonialism and went into museums are on display. This is about objects in storerooms, languishing away. Even in the British Museum, they claim that 100 of the Benin items are on display. I find it hard to count 100, but let's say that's true. They've got over 900. The vast majority of these items are not even on display. So for so many reasons, we have to reject those arguments that have been put. When Cecil Rhodes fell in Cape Town, Achille Mbembe said something which I think is incredibly important in this regard. So Achille said that the falling of Cecil Rhodes, and remember the reason that Rhodes had to fall, was that it was 2015 and apartheid had ended in 1994, and there were students at the University of Cape Town who still experienced institutional racism, experienced direct racism, experienced microaggressions, all that, and yet they've been born after the end of apartheid. And there at the heart of that campus is the image of Cecil John Rhodes, the intellectual and the practical founder of apartheid, the mass murderer, the diamond miner. I'm going to finish on money in a minute, but I mean that's obviously, one example of extractivist colonialism, which is a big part of what this violence is. So the removal of Rhodes is another example. People say, statues, artwork in museums, it's a distraction from the real work of anti-racism. But we all know, everyone in this room knows how important art is, how important culture is. And I hope I've started to raise some issues that we'll look at in our conversation, which is about how art and culture have been weaponized, and how that violence has been made to endure. So Mbembe said that this is a negative moment. The falling of Cecil John Rhodes is a negative moment. The removal of the statue is not just about the negative space that's opened up, the gap, the empty plinth. The negative moment, he says, is when old antagonisms remain but new antagonisms come into play. What he shows is that this is all about what happens next. The physical removal of this white infrastructure is the sine qua non. It is essential that we get rid of it. We can't not do restitution. We can't not remove the hurtful statues when the community wish them to. It's not about all statues. It's not about every African object. It's not about sending back. It's about giving back when asked. It's about allowing our normal historic built environment to change when the community wish it to change. That's obviously central. But that same notion of the war on culture that put statues to work as soldiers, the wonderful line from Fanon when he talks about the world of statues is how he describes the colonial world. A mummified world. And the message of the statue is very simple, we learn from Fanon. The message is, we are here by the force of our bayonets. So too, of course, are those artworks in the museum. So I'm just going to finish on reparation. Because, you know, we have some members here today from this important initiative, the All-Party Parliamentary Group, on restitution and reparation. One thing that can happen after the necessary work, the cultural work of restitution, and I know, Onikachi, I'm hoping you're going to do your 5 R's or your 10 R's, all the R's, you know. So there are lots of R's, we can talk about repair and so on. But restitution and reparation, I think, to put them together are incredibly important. I mean, we talk about restitution rather than repatriation, because this isn't about centering the nation state that so often has been part of the problem. And actually restitution involves so much more than simply giving back. Indeed, with the Benin Bronzes, what's happening in many cases is there's signing over a legal title, and then it's up to the coalition of the Nigerian entities involved and agents involved it's their decision as to where these items will be and when they're on display. So as we learn from Sarre-Savoie, and I remember actually when the Sarre-Savoie report came out, I was visiting professor at the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, and all my French, because it was a French report, so all of my French colleagues were shocked by the fact that this report introduced the language of consent. They said, what on earth, what is this language of sexual violence doing in our museum world? This is not right. But of course, we learn from Felwine and Benedict that exactly what this is about. This is about agency and consent. This is whatever happens next. This is about who decides. In terms of sort of public statues, of course, the equivalent of that is not only who is remembered, but how do we remember? Who is doing the remembering? How can a statue, I mean, so the right will tell us don't rewrite history. So every historian in the room is immediately out of a job. But that confusion of the statue with the man, that confusion of the object with the history, is designed quite cleverly to do something that we all need to attend to far more. A statue can erase history by distracting us. Who are we not remembering? Who's in the shadow of that? What's it in the way of? What's it blocking? What's it silencing? We had a silence at the beginning of this event, a really important one. But silencing can be an action as well. Silence can offer us a time for reflection, but silencing, as we learn from the Haitian anthropologist Trullo, silencing the past can be like silencing a gun. And, you know, the silences, the mentions and silences that he talked about, a statue can be a silencing and a display, even though it tells a story that we think is important, that we want to tell and retell. So I want to finish, as I say, in the last sort of a couple of minutes on reparation. And here I think it's so important because this whole conversation about what some are calling the decolonization of museums and universities and the arts, and what I prefer to see as the unfinished work of anti-colonialism and anti-racism. This operates by moving from one context to another freely. It operates at its best through analogy. We're learning from France and from Berlin. The whole reckoning with the Benin Bronzes has been led from Berlin, not from London. We're seeing what the Americans are doing. We're listening crucially to these African-led movements that are so alive at the present and have these deep histories. Here in the UK, reparation and restitution is important because it unites the common movements of African-led movements for restitution and the Caribbean-led movements around reparation. So this is about this whole sense of this war on culture, the use of culture in these ways, is fundamentally about the sense that abolition is not over, that emancipation is not over, that our museums, and so there by extension, how many other parts of our society, how many parts of our legal system, of our healthcare system, of so many of our parliamentary system, how many parts of our world were similarly put to work to make inequalities last. And I think, and this is my final point, or my final 2 points. So there is a sense in which the violence continues to happen because the museum is and the museum and the statue, these parts of culture that were co-opted and weaponized, are all about things that endure. It's incredibly hard to take down a statue. It's incredibly hard to take an object off display or indeed to restitute it. But we're seeing now that that's happening. But so the hurt continues because it's enduring. But the hope lies in the fact that we don't know how this ends. It's not over yet. These processes, these objects have their own life histories. And they're coming back to life in some cases. And they're finding their way home. So I think there's hope there, and hope, as I say, fundamentally about what happens next. For institutions like the Pitt Rivers in Oxford, we have about 145 of these objects of the 100,000, and I've been doing my best to convince the University of Oxford to return their bronzes. But for institutions like us and for people like me, I think the way to think about it is like this. That we learn from the environmentalists that our major challenge at this moment in time is how to learn to be a good ancestor. We have to learn how to leave a world for those who come after us which is not filled with the toxic, hurtful remains of extractivist capitalism, of disaster capitalism, not poisoned waters, not an overheated world, and so on. For those of us who work not on nature but on culture, in some ways we're dealing with the other side of the coin. Our job, my job at least, in this sense, or those that work in museums, those that work in the arts, those that work in these areas, is to think about what we inherit from these pasts. We have to learn how to be good descendants. And to be good descendants, we have to be ready to refuse what is toxic and hurtful in the present. And we have to, of course, be open to what is of value in our universities and in our museums. So this is not, we need to refuse the framing that this is a war with two sides, that I'm attacking my own institution, that we're attacking the British Museum. We're trying to make these institutions fit for the world in which we live in and fit for the present. So on that point, I'm going to end. Thank you so much.